event is co-organized by the European Forest Institute, C4, and the Technical University of Dresden. And I'm honored that I will be joined by distinguished speakers and scientists in the field of forest policy, governance, and social sciences. I'm really looking forward to the presentations and discussions in the coming 1.5 hours. Before talking about the format of the session, let me briefly introduce our speakers and panelists. I will start with Michael Allen Brady, who is in the room here. He is a principal scientist at C4 and leads the value chains, finance, and investment team. He has worked over 30 years in Indonesia and through East Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa on forest policy and management, forest investment, finance, among many others. So pleasure to have you here, Michael.
Thank you.
And second, to our virtual participant, Professor Lucas Gibson. Mr. Gibson holds a PhD degree in forest policy analysis, as well as a postdoctoral habilitation degree in forest policy and international land use governance, both from Göttingen University. He is a professor in tropical and international forestry at the Technical University of Dresden and the director of Institute of International Forestry and Forest Products. Good to have you there, Lucas, virtually. And third, Sven Wunder. He is a principal scientist at the European Forest Institute. His work over the last 3 decades has centered around forests and natural resource management, development economics, incentive policies for forest conservation, such as payment for environmental services and forest poverty linkage, among many others. Sven, thank you for joining us. I'm delighted to introduce Paolo Cerruti. He is a forester working on sustainable management of tropical production forests, forest certification, timber and wood energy, value chains, and timber trade. Paolo, pleasure to have you here virtually. I'm sure we will feel your presence thanks to the technology later. And then our fourth speaker, Freddy Polo. He is a PhD candidate in international forest governance at the Technical University of Dresden. Freddy will join us later for the panel discussion. He is busy with family duties. He just got his second baby this week. And next, I'm happy to introduce Anna Sanders, who is an environmental social scientist with over 10 years of research and policy engagement in the Asia-Pacific region. She has conducted research for C4 and Australia and Indonesia research program. Welcome, Anna. And finally, Georg Winkel. He is a professor and chair of the Forest and Nature Conservation Policy Group at Wageningen University, the Netherlands. His main research interest encompasses forest and conservation policy, the role of knowledge and discussion in policy, discourses in policy making, and sociology relating to forest and nature. Welcome, Georg. And again, a warm welcome to the speakers, and I thank you all for joining the event despite the time differences and family issues. As for the format of the event, we start with introductory remarks setting the scene by Professor Lucas Gibson, which will be followed by 4 presentations. And then after the presentations, we will have a hybrid panel discussion. And then our distinguished panelists are Paolo Cerruti, Michael here, Freddy, Sven, and Anna. So finally, Professor Georg Winkel will provide the keynote key home take message from the discussions. And for those who are joining online, I will be monitoring the Q&A please put your questions there, and we will be addressing your questions at the end of the discussion. Being that said, now I would like to invite Lucas for an introductory remarks and to set the scene for the session. Lucas, the floor is yours.
Yita, thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, dear colleagues around the world, and especially in Seoul. First of all, I would like to apologize for not having made the way. It was a little bit too much back and forth in order to come up with solid planning. But I'm very, very happy to get this panel together. And because I am in between you and the results to be presented, I will keep myself short on looking on issues, on assessing effects and impacts. And what we see in terms of state of play with regard to international forest policies, international governance initiatives on forests of different kinds, we see a proliferation of such international initiatives into large quantities, each of them identifying certain issues to be addressed, formulating certain goals to be achieved, developing certain instruments for goal attainment, and finally assigning implementation resources and responsibilities to specific actors. And the ultimate goal of such international forest governance policies and initiatives is then to generate effects and impacts. While I will not go into definition of what is impact and effect and what is the different, I still want to highlight they can be very different in nature. They can be political or policy oriented or institutional in nature, more aiming to changes in the social system, or they can be biophysical on the ground in nature, aiming at ecosystem impacts. But what we should never forget is that those initiatives do formulate some intended impacts, what they formally aim at through formulating certain goals, but they also lead to unexpected, unintended, and not formally formulated impacts and effects. So the aim of this session really is to look how to best assess such effectiveness, and by focusing on how, we focus on methods. And this will be reflected by the four really very well and handpicked selected presentations today. I'm very, very glad to get such a broad picture together, building on very different methods. The message I want to convey is analyzing such impacts is not trivial. Even though some people in European commissions or in other offices might think so, for researchers, either scientific or applied researchers, it is not trivial to develop methods for showing causality between international initiatives and things on the ground, and to distinguish between formally intended and informally unintended effects. So if we look at this, intended and unintended effects, and we want to study them or either of them, then the focus of those studies on intended effects is more narrow in nature, while the focus on unintended ones by nature needs to be broader. And then both can look into political, policy, institutional effects or biophysical ones. As foresters, we should always look at social, ecological, and economic impacts, whereas in development cooperation, a strong tendency exists to maybe privilege one over the other. So in terms of methods of assessment, we do look for intended ones, to interdisciplinary methods, but only if needed, if the intended effects require this. Whereas if we also want to take consideration the unintended effects, the broader consequences, what happens around such international governance initiatives, we by nature need an interdisciplinary approach to map sociological, economic, ecological effects of a broad nature. And what I want to highlight, and what we will see in today's session, is that yes, we do draw on qualitative and quantitative methods. Now, who has those capacities for doing such assessments? And this list is not complete, but I want to just highlight that we do have a number of research centers, think tanks, and so on. Some of them in the session, in the panel today, who are very well equipped for doing these swift, more short-term studies on intended effects, with consultants also having capacities there. However, if we look into broader consequences, I think we do need long-term capacities, mainly hosted in universities, also at some research centers and think tanks, some of which are in this room today. And finally, my question is useful for, so who would commission such assessments of impacts? Well, the intended impacts, of course, is very urgent to know for politicians who set up programs and initiatives, to see on a more short rotation, on a more short-term basis, what they achieve, what types of impacts they are able to achieve and which not. So this is more suitable for some sort of short-term engagement, also when companies come and want to have swift impacts. However, I would like to draw also your attention to studying those unintended broader consequences, the long-term consequences. And I think this is very interesting for officers in all different types of authorities and agencies, to see what impacts policies really have in broader society, also in the more long run. But for this, it's only useful for them if they have time. So without further ado, being in between you and the exciting results, Yita, I would like to hand back over to you. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing your results, but also to a follow-up discussion with the participants. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Excellent, lovely. Thank you very much, Lucas, for sharing the insights and setting the scene and posing some useful questions and comments and messages there as well. Thanks a lot. Now let's move to the first presentation by Mikael. He will be presenting on the perception-based methods to assess FLEGT VPA impacts across 7 countries. Mikael, the floor is yours.
Okay. Can you see my screen? Just trying to increase the size. There we go. Okay. Hello, again, my name is Michael Brady. I'm a principal scientist with C4 ICRAF based in Bogor, Indonesia. I'm going to talk about an assessment of the forest legality enforcement, governance, trade, voluntary partnership agreement process. And I'm only going to spell that out full once. So FLEGT VPA. And this is an assessment that colleagues at C4 who are also online, Paolo Cerruti and Jean Newbury, have worked on with a number of C4 staff members, my team included, in Indonesia. But I'll talk about using perception-based methodology to assess impacts. And that maybe just to acknowledge, this is part of a C4 ICRAF program referred to as Governing Multifunctional Landscapes. It's an EU-funded program, mainly in Africa. Also, okay. So the purpose of the study is to synthesize qualitative and quantitative evidence of VPA impacts across 7 countries listed on the slide. And of note, these 7 countries are all at different stages of the voluntary partnership agreement and these agreements started being formed in 2007, going all the way up to Indonesia, which is probably the most mature at the point of FLEGT licensing. Others are still in an implementation phase. And some of the later countries that have joined are still at a negotiating phase. So these 7 countries represent a range of implementation or development of FLEGT. And there was an interest to assess the impact of these countries along that continuum. So part of the impact assessment is really based on the FLEGT action plan monitoring system. And C4 was asked to develop a monitoring and evaluation system to assess the impacts of the FLEGT action plan. Quite a challenge, looking at the effectiveness of a 20-year multi-partner, multi-country program. So the approach that we took was to look at existing available resources, the theories of change and indicators that have been developed in each of the individual countries, and try and identify commonalities to create an overarching theory of change and a set of mapped indicators. The first part of the assessment involved a series of detailed desk reviews looking at secondary information in each country. And this included identifying and coding secondary resources, including things like the forest resource assessment, some of the certification systems, FSC, PEFC, where they were relevant, and other sources of secondary information. But clearly a gap remained, and the need to collect actual site information. And this was generally approached using a perception orientation in the 7 countries. And there were a number of methodological considerations. First of all, the sectors in the 7 countries encompass a large number of results areas, economy, governance, well-being, tenure, among others. So looking at quantitative studies of VPA impacts into each country would be very time-consuming and expensive. So there was a need to identify a more efficient way to assess impacts. And of course, it's difficult to isolate the VPA impacts on the forest sector when just relying on secondary data. So we complemented the secondary data evaluation by identifying in-country experts with a target of 100 experts in each country, with the main forest stakeholder groups represented. So a survey was designed to understand the change trajectories in each country on change in the sector, but also impact and effects of the FLEGT VPA. So questions were asked in the survey on the current situation in each country, the situation prior to the VPA implementation, again at the different stages, different phases of implementation in the 7 countries, and the perceived VPA contribution, including no change at all. So this provides for each indicator a baseline prior to VPA implementation for each of the countries. So how did the assessment work? Some of the practical considerations: to engage with 100 respondents in each country, we leveraged networks and also snowballed using the experts identified. Respondents participating came from private sector, public sector, civil society, and local communities and indigenous peoples. So we tried to achieve quite a nice cross-section. The survey itself was administered in groups of 8 to 20 respondents from similar groups and broken into 2 parts. A closed question survey was answered individually using electronic tablets. And that was followed by a group discussion with the experts, looking at each of the thematic areas that I mentioned before. And these areas that really the core of the assessment are sustainable forest management and forest conditions, relations and development within the forest sector, jobs and employment, law enforcement and compliance, so illegal logging issues, and governance and institutional effectiveness. And these were developed, these impact areas were developed through the theory of change exercise. Just some photos of the survey activities using the tablets. And I'd have to say that the tablets are very effective, used quite extensively now in C4 ICRAF for just about all of our survey work. So results of the perception methodology. So I'm not going to talk about the results of the actual impact assessment, but more on the methodology, and go through some of the strengths and weaknesses. On strengths, we determined that the methodology developed can be used in any country with only contextual changes required. We think it's replicable over time, meaning that students can undertake this type of survey every 3 years, for example, and can measure progress between 2 or more points in time. The samples don't need to be extensive as long as experts are well identified. Across the 7 countries studied, we found that overall the standard deviation was on average small. Some of the weaknesses of the method, while we do believe the method can be used independently of a wider monitoring and evaluation system, results are most effective when placed alongside a wider analysis with more secondary data sources, for example. Some thematic area results, particularly livelihoods and poverty-related impacts, may not be as effectively captured as they're likely to take longest time to materialize. And some of the countries looked at, as I mentioned earlier, were at early stages of VPA implementation. And there's going to be a trickle-down process, particularly on those aspects I mentioned. So with that, I want to provide a link on this last slide to the actual studies themselves. If you've got this presentation, you can go right to the studies on this website, the C4 GML project. With that, thank you very much.
Excellent, just on time. Thanks a lot. Thank you for sharing those insights from the study, and keep your questions and then collect them, think about them, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. So next we will have another presentation by Freddie on systematic literature review on the impacts of FLEGT VPA on tropical countries. Freddie, we have the recordings, and do you want to go through your presentation? I thought that you'll join us later.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
now?
we can hear you.
Yes, so thank you very much. Yes, I will go through my presentation. I am sharing actually screen now.
Excellent.
And if you can all confirm that
yes, we can see
everything is going okay.
Yes, perfect.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good evening for all of you there in Korea. Good morning and good afternoon from all of you joining from other parts of the world. My name is Freddy Polo. I am a PhD candidate from the Technical University Dresden. And today I'm going to present my research entitled Systematic Literature Review on the effect of FLEGT VPAs on tropical countries. Very related to the presentation we just saw a few minutes ago. This research has been developed in partnership with some senior research from the European Forest Institute and also Wageningen University. So to start, first my outline. So I'm going to first answer what very quickly, because you all have already listened why it's important to study FLEGT BPAs, what are FLEGT BPAs effects. Then I'm going to go through my methodology, how did we study them, and then some of the main findings. I will present some of the main findings and some take-home messages that I hope will be useful for all of you. So to start, why is important to study FLEGT BPAs? So for this is mainly important to remember what is the EU FLEGT action plan. This is was adopted by the EU in 2003, and its aim was to combat illegal logging and related trade in timber and to strengthen forest governance. It has two regulatory measures, so the EUTR for one side and the BPA on the supply side. And so only graphically, if we have the EU timber buyers on one side of the slide and the non-EU timber producing countries. So what happened before, that the timber could be sold directly to the EU market, of course, completion or try that must follow some regulations, internal regulation and external regulations. And the EUTR comes into place as an additional barrier to, of course, let some of the products into the EU market, and some of them also push it to other markets, or outside the EU timber market. And on this context, there are some BPA countries, some countries that have signed this BPA, these voluntary partnership agreements, that if they manage to get a FLEGT license, they can sell easily their timber to the EU. Speaking more precisely, what are FLEGT BPAs then? They are bilateral trade agreements between the EU and a timber exporting country. They seek to ensure that all timber products imported into the EU comply with the legislation of the exporting country. And its main instrument is the Timber Legality Assurance System, or the TLAS, which specifies the definition of legal timber and incorporates the FLEGT licensing scheme that I mentioned before. And it has mainly three phases: the negotiation phase, signature and notification, and implementation. And in this last, the FLEGT license is part of. What is the current status so far? So there are some countries in Latin America that are already implementing BPAs, that are Guyana and Honduras. In Africa, there is Cameroon, Central African Republic, Ghana, Liberia, and Republic of Congo. And Asia, mainly Vietnam and Indonesia. Important to highlight that Indonesia is the only one who has managed to have this FLEGT licensing scheme running the last few years. And well, the investment in the preparation, negotiation, and implementation, so in all the phases of the BPAs to date, is estimated in 1.5 billion euros since 2004. However, so far, there is no consensus whether the BPA is an experimental tool or rather one that allows business as usual to continue. There is no comprehensive review of studies reporting on the effects of BPAs, although there are already a number of papers that already explore them. And the overall effects of the FLEGT BPA therefore remain unknown. On this context, our research aims were to discover what are the FLEGT BPAs reported in peer-reviewed empirical studies. So what are the characteristics of these studies as well? And what are the future research needs on the effects of these BPAs? And on this, it's important to conceptualize what are FLEGT BPAs effects. So with this, it's useful to take into account the famous policy dimensions from Neil and Tosun that overlap with the theory of change as well, that we have seen before, that the decision-making processes lead to outputs that are the adoption of a program, law, or regulation, and these outputs lead to outcomes that are the way policies induce behavioral change on the side of targeted actors, and the outcomes lead to impacts that are the extent to which a policy and its subsequent implementation have actually brought the expected results. For us, the effects of BPAs take into account the last two dimensions, outcomes and impacts. Therefore, FLEGT BPAs are the set of intended and unintended outcomes and impacts to which the outputs of the FLEGT BPA process have contributed. But how did we study them? So talking about the methodology, we, as I wrote in the title, we conducted a systematic literature review with different phases. The first one was data search and collection and selection. The data search was conducted with these search terms related to BPAs and legality and timber legality. After removing duplicates, we conducted a first filter with the inclusion criteria that the paper should cover any stage of the FLEGT BPA process. And after retrieving all full text, we conducted a second filter on reviewing all papers with three criteria that should be peer-reviewed articles, that should be method-guided empirical studies, and should report on FLEGT BPA effects. So the second phase was data extraction and categorization. To explain this, we extract general information about the paper, but also the geographical focus, the methodology that they used, and the FLEGT BPA effects. And then we categorize them according to the different categories that you can see on the slide. Finally, the data synthesis, how we synthesize the findings. So we use this framework from Wunder et al. 2019 to categorize the effects of BPAs into consensual, trend, controversial, or knowledge gap, based on the number of studies that report on them and the degree of agreement among the studies that report on the different effects. Therefore, consensual were effects that had a relevant number of studies that reporting on them and a high degree of agreement. The trend was occurred where there were only few studies and the degree of agreement was also high, and the controversial were when there were numerous studies, but the degree of agreement was quite low, and knowledge gap were all other possibilities. So important was also to highlight the different typologies or the categories of study designs that we use to classify the empirical studies. So this is our framework. There were some case reports that focus on a target area, how this intervention impact the target area. We also have another category on case control 1 that take into account this the same as the case report, the effect of an intervention as a target area, but also had into account a similar control area to compare with. In the case control 2, very similar to case control 1, the only difference is that they take into account confounding variables. The next category was quasi-experimental, that similar to the case controls, they had some target area and that observed and were impacted by an intervention, but the control was as similar as possible using different methodologies to model it. And therefore, and lastly, this random control trial where there is an area that was the target area and a control area, take into account also the confounding variables, and the studies took a random sample from the control area or the target area. So this is a framework how we classify the studies that we found. Our main findings on this regard are, first, a general overview. So we had 33 studies that met our criteria. 73% have been published since 2017, 73% in 4 journals. 70% focus on a single country at a time. Most studies focused on 3 countries that were Indonesia, Ghana, and Cameroon. 96% employed case reports, and 1 was a case control study. So mainly were case reports. 85% use only qualitative data, and 64% only collected data only during the implementation phase of the BPA process. Regarding consensual effect, the consensual effects that we found 3. So the first one is that BPAs contributed to increase stakeholder participation, but have had mixed effects on different stakeholder groups, favoring some, such as CSOs or civil society organizations, and disadvantaging or even excluding others, as small timber firms, artisans, and local communities. BPAs also contributed to increase the institutional capacity of various forest sector organizations, but have mixed effects in the programs and the quality of services provided by these organizations. The last consensual effect is that BPAs contributed to increase the concern for the livelihoods of local populations. However, the safeguards put in place were not sufficient to prevent the negative effects of the BPA legality and transparency requirements on these populations. But we also found some trends in effects. So BPAs contributed to the development of information disclosure mechanisms, making information available, but the information is not accessible and understandable by some of the stakeholders. BPAs also contributed to the establishment of accounting processes, mechanisms, but still not all supply chain actors are accountable because they have adopted some strategies to circumvent legality. BPAs contributed to enhance forest law enforcement by establishing and supporting various mechanisms, but have not yet achieved compliance with all actors in the timber supply chain. BPAs contribute to mixed effect on forest access and tenure, disadvantaging local access while favoring the international one. Importantly, regarding to market development, to international market development, BPAs contributed to increase the operational cost of timber exporting companies due to additional efforts in terms of legality, and also contributed to decrease the volume of timber exported by BPA countries to the EU, resulting in the substitution by EU importers and its diversion by BPA exporters to other markets, such as emerging economies, neighboring countries, and the domestic market. BPAs also contributed to hinder the access of some local actors, such as non-exporting timber companies and smallholders, and to the domestic market through legality efforts, such as valid business registration and operational license. But we also found some knowledge gaps regarding the illegal logging, the effect of BPAs on illegal logging and forest conditions, and on broader consequences, such as effects in other sectors, such, for example, the agricultural sector. Importantly, that all the findings that we just present were based in the different studies that, and all the data that we collected is now available on the Conservation Effectiveness platform. You can see there the link, and then this is
1 minute.
Just
1 minute.
Thank you. This is an interactive platform that you can all review. So to finalize some take-home messages, this research is limited by the review methodology we use, the methods employed by the studies reviewed, and the intrinsic challenges associated with evaluating policy effectiveness. More quantitative and mixed effects empirical studies are needed in countries other than the 3 dominant ones, assessing more than 1 country simultaneously and comparing them. It is essential to employ study designs that allow for a statistical analysis of causality between the BPA process and its effects. As we mentioned, it's important to include counterfactual and confounding variables. I think I will leave it there to these conclusions on the methodology.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. Indeed, more research is needed. Thank you. Thanks a lot. And then let's move to the third presentation by Sven Wunder. He will be talking about rigorous impact evaluation of REDD+, a global meta study. Sven, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Rosa, can share the screen?
Yes, please.
For the slides.
Good evening, Korea. Good day to the rest of the world. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to show these results. I'm Sven Wunder, principal scientist with EFI. I'm also site affiliated to C4 and also presenting on behalf of colleagues at the University of Bonn that have contributed to this study. Next, please. So we want to know about the rigorous evaluated impact of REDD+, and for that, again, we need to see what are we actually talking about. We're talking about a bundle of very different interventions, and this is from the C4 Global Comparative Study on REDD. So we typically find on the ground in these REDD+ projects some conditional livelihood enhancement like payments for environmental services, some non-conditional incentives, forest enhancements, environmental education, a clarification of the tenure rights, but also more command and control about enforcing access. And what we find is many projects do small things of everything with a low treatment intensity. And that's also obviously because many of them are designed as pilots for trying out things, which means not necessarily for maximizing their impact. Next, please. And of course, we can put these things into a theory of change, just like Freddie did here. And we typically start out with some funding and some baseline information on the left-hand side as key inputs. We then have treatments, which can be, as I mentioned, both incentives, disincentives, and enabling measures. And these lead to some output, some changes in the behavior of the different agents. And then we have what Freddie called effects, which can be outcomes at the land use level, and longer term impacts. And the impacts, obviously the key thing would be to the goal on the right hand side here to contribute to mitigate global greenhouse gas emissions, but also related objectives on the biodiversity side, on vis-a-vis human well-being, etc., land rights, etc. Next, please. So how is the impact supposed to be detected? Well, this is a project from the Brazilian Amazon, and you have the fully boldly drawn line shows you the deforestation in an area with the REDD project started in 2010. You have some control areas below that have a similar trajectory in a parallel line, and you evaluate the difference between the two, which shows you the impact of REDD+. Next, please. That's what is wrong. Next, please. Yeah. But if we look at, how much REDD has been done in the world over the last 15 years, since 2007, since it was conceived at the Bali UNFCCC conference. So 350 REDD projects, which according to their PDDs, should avoid like 1% of annual forest-based emissions, but only 5% of those credits have actually been sold, as was found by a C4 study from 2018. So it's not that much. Again, these pilots occupy. Next, please. And some previous impact study, this also done as part of the C4 GCS. We looked at, what's out there in 2018 in terms of studies. We actually found that only 12 studies looked at really forest, carbon, and land use outcomes in a quantitative way. 26 studies looked at other things, more on the welfare side and tenure side, etc. The results were typically some positive carbon and land use impacts, but with quite a large range of outcomes, and mostly insignificant impacts on the income and human well-being side. Next, please. So with that in mind, we decided to do our sort of more recent meta study on this, and define some filters, both in terms of the action on the ground and in terms of the publications. As for the actions on the ground, we want to look at things that label themselves as REDD+, but also that otherwise act as REDD+ of avoiding deforestation and forest degradation. So we want to be inclusive on that side. But as for the action, we want to exclude those that are typical afforestation and reforestation projects. We also want to look at both national and subnational initiatives. And we put in a line in the sand in 2007 of the Bali COP in terms of the starting time of the action. So as for the literature part, we want to have both peer-reviewed and grey literature. In grey literature, we assess the rigor itself, for instance, working papers and institutional reports, etc. We want to look at both forest carbon and well-being impacts. And we also want to go in the outcome part with about forest cover loss and socioeconomic variables that we can define, but not more into the middle part of the theory of change and the output side. We want to include also subjective well-being assessments, how people self-report both land use clearing, etc., but also their well-being impacts. But we want to be strict in terms of restricting ourselves to quasi-experimental methods, to rigorous impact evaluations in terms of counterfactual approaches that are constructed. What would have happened without that REDD intervention? Next, please. And that is our sort of our prisma diagram. We're looking at quite a large number of interventions. Used machine learning to refine it. And then ended up, this should show, next please. Oh, it doesn't show. Good, but we ended up with around 30 or so something case studies with like 25 impact sizes on the land use side and about the same at the welfare side. And here I'm showing the results. The results for the REDD+, the land use effect. You can see the overall coefficient is positive and significant. So there is a positive impact overall. We've grouped the results here in terms of on the one hand, directly focused REDD+ projects and programs, and the second, more national pest programs that have carbon as an explicit objective among various, right? And for both of these, we do find some programs that have positive effects. Others are closer to zero. Next, please. And in the sort of the literature on payments for environmental services in particular, shows us that the design of these programs will typically matter. For instance, you would expect if you do some strong spatial targeting related to density of environmental services or to threats or both, you get better results. You get higher impact sizes, as shown here by the hedges G. And the same if you do differentiated payments, you would be expected to get better results than if you just do a uniform flat payment. And both of these trends are visible in our data, but the sample size is just too small vis-a-vis the differences observed. The differences are not statistically significant, although they go in the expected direction. Next, please. Another thing would be for us to look at REDD+ compared to other conservation tools. And it's the same similar group of authors. We did a few years ago an assessment of a lot of other types of interventions that we're comparing here. Our REDD+ results on the right-hand side with those. And again, we can see REDD+. The standard deviation is quite big, but the average impact is actually decently is higher than for the others, but not that much higher in order to be a statistically significant difference. Next, please. Some duplication here. Next, please. So this is for my conclusions. And on the first slide, I would say, REDD+ had a lot of hopes connected to it for being a cost-effective alternative for mitigating climate change. I think cautiously assessing what we've seen here after 15 years is that it's still a bit of an unfulfilled promise, and that unfulfillment is perhaps organized in Chinese boxes. Next, please. In terms of a key thing being that the whole REDD+ actually has remained strongly underfinanced. We're supposed to imagine these carbon markets that would take off and transfer huge resources into these type of initiatives. That has not played out. Next, please. Also, the project scope is just simply very limited for these pilot projects. As I mentioned before, both by their proper size, but also by the fact that so few carbon credits have been sold. It remains a drop in the sea vis-a-vis climate change. Next, please. But we can say also that REDD+ is a little bit to carbon what integrated conservation and development programs, ICDPs, have been to biodiversity, namely, a quite heterogeneous mix of an umbrella with a lot of things in it in terms of on-the-ground interventions. Next. And we can say the land use and carbon impacts of these implemented policy mixes, there's not been that much evaluation of it. There's maybe been more focus on some of the land rights and broader social science type of impacts. Next. What we do find that for those welfare assessments that we could make here in the quantitative analysis, they actually tend to be neutral. The coefficient is we find is 0.0, meaning that most of these interventions have no or negligible impacts on people's welfare. That's maybe comforting for those who are worried that they could jeopardize livelihoods. On the other hand, it's disappointing to those who are looking for double dividends from these approaches. Next.
You have only 1 minute.
Yes, last slide. But on the positive side, I would say don't just give up on REDD+ yet. Next. because you know, as academics perhaps and to some extent have become disappointed with REDD, post Paris, UNFCCC, there have been quite some significant funding flows coming in that direction. The Global Carbon Fund, the World Bank's FCPF, and there's been an upscaling to jurisdictional approaches that due to their larger scale will probably have less leakage and better chances of success. Next. I think REDD Plus could be a part of policy mixes, sort of as an area-based intervention that could be combined with value chain interventions to what has been called produce and protect type of strategies. Next. And even as just said, the proper impacts of the studies that we found so far, they're actually not too bad in terms of their size. Of course, we're not looking here at the costs of these projects, and some of them have been quite expensive, being boutique showcase projects of so cost efficiency is something and we need to look into just as a permanent part. Next.
Excellent.
And the a final remark. I think, as I said, academics are maybe quick now to reject REDD Plus, and I think as scientists we are sometimes maybe too quick to reject things. We're not giving it enough time to develop the experiences, to gather the experiences and learn. And rather we jump onto the next big thing. So I would caution against that and finish on that note. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Please join me thanking Luca. Excellent. Well done. So let's move to our final presentation to Anna, who will be talking about actor-based ethnographic approach to understand REDD Plus impacts. Rosa, if you can share the slide. Yes, excellent. Anna, the floor is yours.
You can see my slide. Thank you. My slide's up on the screen.
Yes.
Yep, terrific. All right. Good evening, everyone. My name's Anna Sanders from the University of Melbourne. So I'm presenting by video from my home here in Australia. And to begin, what is common in my country is an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking on the traditional land of the Larrakia people, and I'd like to pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the Yitagesu people on whose rivers and lands I conducted my PhD fieldwork in Central Kalimantan province in Indonesia. And what I'll do for this presentation is I'll begin by talking about some core features of ethnography, and also reflect with two examples of my fieldwork for C4's global comparative study on REDD Plus. And then to finish, I'll also discuss some key challenges to ethnographic research in tropical forest regions. So ethnography has its origins in social and cultural anthropology. So its methods principally field-based observation and interview. So they're largely kind of qualitative, and they aim to generate in-depth or thick description of everyday life and cultural practice. So a core feature of ethnography is the focus on a particular context and people's lived experiences. And what that means as a methodology is that ethnography is not aiming to provide general trends or comparisons. So that means, for example, its methods don't provide statistical observation beyond a selected sample group. For example, a sample group that might comprise people in a village who receive benefits from a REDD project. So a weakness by argument is that the results of qualitative and ethnographic approaches can't be replicated. But I would also argue that the lack of generalizability is a strength and not a weakness, because the emphasis on in-depth observation and building trust and dialogue with local research participants can give insight into the historical complexity and contextual differences of a social setting. So my PhD research during 2013 and 2015 was funded and conducted as part of C4's global comparative study on REDD. And it was under a research module led by Anne Larson on multi-level governance. And a specific concern of the multi-level governance work was to understand the priorities and the competing interests of the multiple actors involved, not only in REDD+ projects, but also broader land use decision-making across different sectors and levels of government. And the research module specifically focused on subnational implementation of REDD+ in several countries, including Indonesia. And the research design incorporated actor-based ethnographic approaches that included in-depth interviews and field-based observation. And the study selected multiple field sites that included REDD+ projects and forest conservation, as well as intersecting competing types of land use change. For example, in the region where I worked, that was large-scale industrial land use permits for oil palm plantations. So the multi-level governance study addressed, I guess, the big picture questions of REDD: effectiveness, justice, and the legitimacy of procedures and outcomes of land use change in tropical forest regions. And the, I guess, broader kind of study findings underscored, for example, limitations in technical design of REDD, or an emphasis on the coordination of actors. And in turn, it also emphasized the need to engage competing land use interests and address power inequalities that influence decisions on the ground. So as Sven mentioned, REDD is very heterogeneous and comprises, multiple types of projects and interventions. And what I'll do is discuss two examples of REDD+ projects from my fieldwork in Central Kalimantan province. So one project, as I've put up on the slide, was an Australian government funded project, the Kalimantan Forest and Climate Partnership, or KFCP. And the KCP was one of the largest and early examples of a REDD+ pilot or demonstration project. And I think as such a big and early example, it attracted a lot of attention and criticism during implementation. So the project ended back in 2014, and my fieldwork, including in villages where the project was implemented, occurred during the final months of project implementation, as well as the year after the project had ended. And through in-depth interviews with multiple actors that included local government, civil society, and community members who were directly involved in the project, my fieldwork sought to understand the divergent interpretations and disagreements about the project design and implementation, as well as the different types of learning that had emerged over several years of implementation. And this actor-based ethnographic approach and the timing of my fieldwork at the end of the project led me to challenge a simplified narrative of project success or project failure. And what I sought to do was to identify lessons for future projects. For example, the additional time needed for the involvement of local stakeholders, including government agencies and NGOs in the initial design of participation, as well as for the learning goals as a pilot project to be explicitly identified in the project aims. All right, so the second project I'll talk about is the Katingan Mentengaya project. So this is, I guess, different to a pilot project. It's a privately funded REDD+ project that utilizes an ecosystem restoration concession, which in Indonesia is a type of 60-year national forestry permit. And ministerial approval of the first concession in late 2013 followed what was a 5-year process, which was really difficult for the project proponents, with multiple steps and delays at each level. All right, so I've put up the map on the right side, which hopefully you can look at. And the reason I've put it up is to kind of give you a sense of the complexity of the land use situation, where the final ministerial approval of the ecosystem restoration concession removed the pink coloured section closest to the villages along the Katingan River, where a large oil palm plantation permit was issued by the district government. So just using my arrow, I'm referring to this pink section here, and then sort of moving sort of down in that section there. And during the consultation process that I observed in 2014, local villagers were concerned about the history of intervention and the prior negative experience of forest conservation in turn influenced their perception of the REDD+ project. So for example, this negative experience involved their exclusion from Sabangau National Park, which is this big kind of purple section in the map here. And yeah, I guess, again, I hope sort of putting that map up gives you just a sense of a really complex land use situation. And in this complex situation, the future benefits of REDD to be realised, for example, through international forest carbon markets, were abstract and hard for villagers to understand. For that reason, I also selected the photo which is on the left side of the slide. And that showed a common occurrence during the consultation process when villagers would crouch around the maps to try to interpret the location and, oh, sorry, I've gone too far. So yeah, they'd sort of try to interpret the location and the potential implications of the project for their current and future land access and livelihood needs. And as they crouched around the map, some were interested in palm oil, while others wanted to know about the potential future benefits of their involvement in the Katingan Mentengaya project. And reflecting on my fieldwork back in 2014 during these consultations, I would argue that long-term and longitudinal ethnographic fieldwork is needed to understand the project impacts, not only short-term and isolated visits without enough time and by argument funding for this kind of long-term follow-up. Also important, and I think is kind of a strength of ethnographic approaches, is to engage the multiple actors involved in and surrounding the project as a way to understand those competing land use interests and the wider implications of landscape change for local people and environments.
You have 1 minute, try to wrap up.
Yeah, I always like to give too much detail and then I ran out of time. So let me wrap up really quickly, and forgive me if I need 1 or 2 extra minutes. So ethnographic research is usually field-based. So there's issues of access and costs that are complicated in the context of COVID-19, but also provide opportunities for building local research skills and capacities to undertake the fieldwork. General templates and questionnaires, for example, interview guides also for ethnographic research are needed for global and regional studies. But these types of general templates are hard to adapt to specific countries and regions. So this work of translation requires researcher training and building the skills needed to interpret and adapt the overall research aims and priorities for, into local contexts. Just to reflect a bit also on research funding in the case of the KFCP project, because I think that's really interesting. Often this funding is directed towards a project when it's first announced, and this can have unplanned consequences such as multiple researchers showing up in a village to ask questions, and then excessive reporting of a project's failure during the initial phases. So such as occurred in the KFCP project, this fast style of research reporting can jeopardize donor commitments and even lead to the early termination of projects. And it can also mean that less time is invested in fieldwork during the later stages of implementation and for understanding the impacts of a project after it's ended. And I think sort of just to finish and reflect on that example of the KFCP, at the time that the Australian government withdrew funding and support for this project, another large oil palm concession was issued at the back of several villages. So I think a really important question here is which impacts and outcomes are counted, particularly in terms of the long-term environmental impacts and livelihood consequences of land use change, not only the immediate project impacts that are observed during a short time period of implementation. So I think sort of that is really an argument for the importance and value of long-term and longitudinal research and how this can give insight into how REDD objectives and competing land use interests are negotiated and influence each other over time. But of course, that type of research is expensive, difficult in the field, and hard to sustain. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. I feel that you have lots of insight to share, but for the sake of time, let's stop it there. And I thank you very much. Excellent. Well done. Great. So I really enjoyed the presentations. I hope you did so. So now let me open the floor for questions and immediate comments. I will start from the participant in the room, and then I will come to the online participant. And for the online participant, I would like you to speak out your questions instead of me reading your question. I'll mention your name, or you can use the raise hand tool of Zoom function, and then I will invite you. Okay. Yes.
Thanks, Yita, and thank you so much to all the panelists for the insightful presentations on FLEGT and REDD+. So my name is Satrio Adiwijaksono. I am from EFI, although I'm from the EU REDD facility that deals more on the policy support rather than research. So I guess my question is intended to all panelists, actually. So I was wondering if you can share some insights, when you were disseminating or communicating about the results of your research into the initiators of the initiative or key proponents, funders. So in the case of FLEGT, maybe with the EU or European Commission. In the case of REDD, maybe with I don't know, UN REDD or some other, proponents, and maybe in the case of, I guess I was wondering like how, how such a dissemination went, and also whether that might have led into some adjustments or alteration in the course of the implementation as a result of your, research recommendations. And maybe in the context of Anna's research, I mean, you mentioned about the Katingan Mentengaya project, how has your research been utilized, for example, by the Katingan Mentengaya project? Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Satrio. Yes, Mikhail.
Thanks for that. I'd actually like to ask my colleague Paolo to address your question. the FLEGT VPA assessment initially focused on 3 countries and was expanded to 7. And that was obviously through engagement with the EU, but maybe Paulo can address that in more detail and some of the initial responses from the client.
Yeah,
Paulo?
yeah. Well, they were. So it was something that was born out of an assessment that was done, evaluation actually done of the whole program in 2016, and the evaluators found that those that were trying to implement, so in this specific case, the European Commission, did not have a clear understanding of where they were coming from and where they were going. I think they had, I mean, internally they had, but they didn't have the tools or the strategies very well laid out, which is a theory of change, which is how do we monitor that theory of change. And so that's where the initial request came from. It's funny, if you want funny, not so funny, but it's interesting that actually the initial request came for a need of better communication within the European Commission, and that's important because the bureaucratic level within the Commission had to communicate better to their own bosses. And that's also interesting because sometimes we think that actually there are other interests or other ways of doing the same things, but it led to a long-term process. As you said in the presentation, Michael, the important thing is that you need to consider this as part of a broader monitoring and evaluation strategy. I don't know if I've responded clearly to the question.
I think so. Indeed, you responded, and if I see Satra's, heading his head, so which means he's satisfied. Excellent. Is there any? Okay, please. And just, mention your name and affiliation as well.
Sure. So hello, everyone. My name is Ainur Mamadova. I'm a research fellow at the University of Padua. Thank you for interesting presentations and discussions. It's a pity that most of you couldn't come here to be with us in person. So I want to ask about, research methodologies for analyzing effectiveness, policy effectiveness, and impact assessment. And also relating back to the comments made in the introductory slides during the introductory speech, I wonder if there are any methodologies being developed for impact and effectiveness assessment that would take the impacts and effectiveness of these policies in a more systematic way and understand how certain policies and the results of certain policies cancel out or enhance the effects and impacts of the others, and that applies the policies and strategies within the sector, but also in other sectors. And I wonder if there are any works in this direction. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much. May I start with Sven? And I know that you raise your hand and maybe you would like to say something concerning the previous question as well. Maybe if you combine that too.
Yes. So on the previous question, I mean, I think for our setup was we were not being asked by the donors to do our assessment, but by the donor of the intervention. So that gives you obviously also a bit more degrees of liberty because you're not evaluating the donor's action. But we did take, notably, we took the results to NICFI, to the Norwegians who have funded a very big share of the, as you know, of the REDD Plus interventions on the ground, and a lot of the also the projects and the bilateral country level jurisdictional payments. And in that case, I mean, it tied into a picture they already had that the REDD Plus projects are not sufficiently impactful, and they want to move to a more jurisdictional approach, and at least our research supported that to a certain extent. So in that sense, I would say yes, there might have been a positive impact. We have not journal published our studies yet. The question from Padua, I'm not sure I understood exactly in what direction it went, but often what we can see is that there are policy mixes that are acting on the ground, and it's the more mix you have, the harder it is to find out, to attribute impacts on the ground to specific actions within the policy mix. So I think that's a difficulty that any type of heterogeneous umbrella type of intervention like ICDPs, like REDD+ are facing, and it's perhaps one feedback also to the implementers of these mechanisms. They try out a lot of different things. Let's see, what might be working, but actually it might be better to do certain pure actions that you clearly evaluate, that you from the beginning you set up in a way that you allow for impact evaluation and get some clear learning out of what you're doing. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sven. I see Freddy's and Paulo's hand. I'll come back to you, Lucas. Just let me address to the panelists first. Paulo.
Just one comment on the question from Padova. It's not always cancel out. So, you don't always have to think negatively. We did find actually that some processes also add up to very, very not willing, basically, but in some countries you can ask specific question to what other processes, for example, have benefited much from what's going on here. And that's very difficult to pin in a theory of change because these are really externalities, if you want. So it's not always that processes plays one against the other. Sometimes there are synergies, and you need to be able to capture there in a way, I think, because for policy, it's very important. The learning that other policy processes going in other direction can have from your current process. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. The learning from other policies is really crucial and important, and we need to leverage on that. I strongly agree with that. And Freddy.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for this question from the University of Padua. It really me reflect a bit. But to answer maybe directly to your question related to BPAs, so as Sven mentioned before, it's very tricky, especially with case report study designs, to really attribute an effect to a specific policy or to the context. Even researchers acknowledge these limitations. No, what came up to my mind is with your question is that we are, for example, working now identifying first the different initiatives that can exist in different contexts. For example, what we call regional regimes, this big group of policies addressing a specific issue, and there are some strategies to try to analyze them as a group, no? How these regimes are effective or not on the way. Of course, it is also challenging to gather the data when you want to analyze many policies at the same time and on different geographical regions. But yeah, that it's also what came to my mind. And I think maybe this is also useful for the discussion to have in mind that we can also analyze them as a group and not as a solely policy.
Yes, indeed, that's very useful, Freddy. Thanks for sharing that. Anna, if you have any last point on that as well.
Hi, yeah. I just wanted to add a reflection on the problem of attribution. REDD interventions and projects are often implemented in complex land use situations, such as the one I described for the Katinga Mentengaya project, where there are kind of histories of intervention. There are existing kind of efforts at forest conservation, as well as large-scale land development, such as mining and oil palm plantations. So it's incredibly difficult in those complex land use situations to identify, which kind of benefits can be attributed to a particular intervention, particularly when there are challenges associated with implementing that intervention, such as with regard to competing land use interests, issues of governance, even basic things like getting a concession approval through, such as for the ecosystem restoration concession. I think sort of within that sort of problem of attribution, there are other sort of questions that we can ask about what these types of international policy interventions are trying to achieve, particularly with regard to pilot and demonstration projects. For example, with the KFCP, some of the really significant project components were not implemented. So from a land use and environmental perspective, you could argue that those significant components failed because they were not successfully implemented. But there was a huge amount of learning that went on within that project. And there are kind of subsequent kind of projects and initiatives that are going on in that space. So that kind of problem of attribution, I think, relates to the complex land use situation. But I think we can also widen our lens to ask different types of questions about these projects, particularly with regard to learning and what lessons can be incorporated in thinking about future REDD+ or other type of interventions. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Anna. And there's
a question for Sven in the chat.
Yes, yeah, there is a question, yeah, in the chat, yes. Lucas, may I give you the floor now? And then after that, maybe I'll give to Ben. He has a question in the chat.
Yes, thank you very much. And maybe some of the remote participants are able to switch on their cameras. This would give us a more live group feeling even. So to address the first question, I think I want to stress and reiterate that from a research and scientific perspective, there is not one way of doing assessment and evaluation, but that it very much depends on your purpose, on the purpose why you want to study and what you want to study. And those purposes are extremely diverse, stretching from, narrow donor interests all the way to broadest academic interests of whatever kind. So keep that in mind. So the purpose is very decisive for the types of assessments and of evaluations. And of course, there are different organizations, what I tried to highlight in my introduction, different organizations capable of doing or also of not doing certain types of assessments. And that goes with different types of methodologies and methods, qualitative and or quantitative, but also with different types of purposes. And I would like to stress that there is a distinct difference between research centers, think tanks, on the one hand, academic university institutions on the other hand, and then more swiftly and more readily available all different types of consultancy services. But maybe going to that second question on whether there are specific systematic methodologies being developed for addressing effectiveness of a single policy or intervention. And I think I want to argue that the methods are readily available to collect data and so forth, but the whole methodology that again relies largely on the purpose and of the specific context. And I think Paolo in his study, they made big efforts of thinking really this theory of change, of how to model, how to design this methodology, even though the data collection methods were already there. So it then depends on the purpose and takes quite some effort. And this effort might be oftentimes underestimated by decision makers, donors, politicians who say, come on, please measure the impacts swiftly.
Yes, excellent. Indeed, the purpose and context are really crucial, Lucas. They are really important when you, in our endeavor to actually assess the impacts of forest policies. And then now I would like to give the floor to Ben. Ben, just speak through your questions.
Sure. Thanks for the thanks for the presentations. Really interesting. I'm joining you from London School of Economics, where we now have a forest lab focused on questions of development with a Central African focus. So that just started up six months ago or so. So hopefully you'll see some stuff from us over the next few years. But my question was first for Sven. I was just wondering in the sort of meta-analytical results you presented, I guess you read the question, but do you think there could be a role for leakage in impacting a response variable?
Yes, so I think what we have to keep in mind is that we are looking here at we're doing a meta study, so we're not directly involved with the design of the methodology of how to assess the impacts. We look if it's a rigorously done study, and if so, we include it. But I think the leakage problem has been identified, even by BCS, by different actors, as one of the things that is affecting especially smaller scale red actions that are pushing some of these deforestation pressure from within the project area to outside the project area. I do find also sometimes that people are kind of they are assuming that all will be leakage and that no impacts remain. That's very seldom the case. I think the leakage estimates for individual studies and programs that we find in terms of deforestation, they have been maybe between 5 and 20% or something like that. So I would expect some impact, but not a disastrous level.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sven. And yeah, so we are running out of time, and I'm really terrible in keeping the time. So maybe let me ask Georg to give us home take message to conclude the event. Georg, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, colleagues. So first of all, congratulations to the organizers for putting together a really nice series of speeches and quite fascinating evaluation work. And also congratulations to those in the room and those being virtually connected for putting interesting questions and comments. No worries, this will not be another long presentation, but I put some points now on the slide that I just shared with Rosa. Could you click to the next slide, please, Rosa? 6 points, and I come in from a perspective, let's say, of an academic researcher thinking about how now to do evaluation of policy impacts. And my first point is that I think it's important to take a step back at the beginning and look at the bigger picture first. So I think it's interesting, or it's important to look really, so what is the problem policies want to tackle? What is included in the problem? What solution ways do they have? But also what is excluded? So what is not problematized? We have deforestation, we have conservation, we have sustainable use, but we also have development and trade and markets. And I think this sort of bigger, and also the question, why do we have the policies? What do we know? How they have been emerging? I think this is the first step, and to keep that in mind until the very end of the evaluation of impacts, to not forget that these policies are in the end, I think, one puzzle in a mosaic of how global forest governance affects our forest. Next point. Then something that has partly come up in this panel, but perhaps even not enough, is to see evaluation also a bit of a co-production process. I think this has different elements. First of all, the element that when we talk about what do we really want to know about impacts, that we do not only look at, let's say, the prescribed expectation of a policy formulated by certain policymakers in Brussels or wherever on the planet, but that we really look broader at all the groups that are concerned and impacted, and that we include them in our problem formulation. So to understand a bit, so who is really impacted? What questions do different parts of society and groups ask about the policy? It also means interpreting findings together with those groups and policymakers. But it could also mean, I recall that this has been a big issue now in the review that Freddie has been presenting, to also include knowledge that's not published in peer-reviewed journal papers. So how do we deal with gray knowledge? How do we deal with tacit knowledge? How can we include this in an evaluation process? The perception research that Paulo has presented could be interesting there, but perhaps we need to go even one step further. And at the same time, we should not forget to keep also some room for critical thinking and independent thinking of researchers, that to give some freedom, let's say, for that. Next point, please, Rosa. Yeah, I mean, it was quite interesting to see the different views and approaches from ethnography to rigorous impact assessment today or tonight. And I think for me, this calls for involving different disciplines. I think it was Lucas saying in the beginning, was it something like that, Lucas? Hopefully I'm not quoting you wrong. As far as this, we look at everything a bit. Yeah, but I think it's important to not only involve the social sciences, governance, economics, but also ecologists, other disciplines, because we all are in our work reducing somehow complexity. We have certain biases. We are interested in environmental justice, perhaps, or we're interested in ecological inequity, or however we call it. And in the end, this reduction of complexity is needed to come to an assessment, but it's also narrowing down the perspectives. So either in designing evaluation studies, it is interesting to work across disciplines, or later, at least in meta studies, also to see the different shortcomings and to come to more synergetic idea system perspectives on what are policy impacts. Fourth point, Rosa? Yeah, I think it's also an idea to, how to say, to liaise Anna's work and Sven's work a bit. So basically to bring together these large scale, rigorous, counterfactual studies where you really look at the big picture. And at the same time, you cannot go deep. You really look more at the differences and try to understand which factors have been impacting global policies and have been, what can we see there, to combine it with the more qualitative, in-depth, perhaps causality seeking case study research. It could also be done in the design of evaluation research, but again, when you come to this meta level is another possibility. I think that could be quite charming. It will not be easy because it means bringing people together that speak a quite different jargon, have very different paradigms they're operating in. But if that succeeds, I think it can be quite powerful in explaining really differences on one hand, large scale, but a bit more, I don't want to say superficial, at the same time then more narrow, but in depth, looking at interdependencies, even on local levels. Fifth point. Yeah, I think it was said by Lucas initially that evaluation does not mean only to look at what is expected, but to also look at what is unexpected. So what are really the consequences of policies? What do we see there? What are the intended, unintended? Sometimes you don't know what was intended or unintended, but to have this broader perspective, and basically this connects back to point one, to at the beginning take a step back and to really understand what kind of policy do we have there, in what context, in which bigger discourse does it operate. Next and last point. Yeah, be clear and humble. I mean, this is perhaps for us researchers that, and we saw this also when reviewing the literature on the FLEGT DPA impacts. Sometimes you have very strong statements in the literature, and this is valuable on one hand because it creates academic debate, it creates a science policy debate. At the same time, and I think it's also needed to be clear in assessments. At the same time, I think it's also important to be a bit humble about the reduction that you cannot avoid when you do evaluation research, or if you look at consequences of policies. So be aware and explicit of the limitations. I think it was Paolo putting something in the chat, but policymakers don't want to hear. It's so complex, we can't manage, we can't evaluate. Of course, that's not what you want to do. At the same time, you should not suggest that you understand it all and it's all clear based on your work. It's always important to look at the limitations. And I think this panel was quite insightful in showing the strengths and limitations of different approaches. So that would be my 6-point take-home message. Thanks again for the opportunity to listen in. It was very interesting. I knew some of the studies, others I have not seen before. Yeah, and good luck with continuing evaluation research. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. With those closing remarks, we close the session, and please join me in thanking all the speakers and then the introductory remarks. Yes, thank you very much. And then with this, we end the session. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.